stuff. Let's actually put this together, right? So you follow along the last series, or this series, I should say. You're like, okay, I understand pretty well in terms of how I'm going to design my resistance training stuff, right? I'm like, okay, I'm going to choose these exercises. I've really, dialed in on my goal. I've got all that sorted, right? But I want to bring in some cardiovascular conditioning because I want to be fit. I understand that it's a good thing to have, a good thing to do to keep myself healthy long term. So how do we actually integrate this stuff? And it's actually quite straightforward because we can look at this in terms of, we'll just call it intensity levels, right? And the first thing we want to do to bring in some cardiovascular conditioning is to bring in background cardiovascular conditioning. And what I mean by this is just bring your steps or your general like non-exercise activity thermogenesis to a good place, right? Doesn't need to be hugely fatiguing. Again, like if it's just neat, you're basically just walking around a bit more, it's probably not all that fatiguing, right? But it does lead to some sort of cardiovascular conditioning. It does lead to some cardiovascular adaptations that lead you to a position where you have better health, right? It also encourages blood flow. So it actually probably makes your current resistance training a little bit easier to recover from rather than just having that kind of, we'll call it quote unquote stagnant blood, right? Obviously your blood is pumping around your body, but what I mean by that is you're not actually getting it, deep into the muscle, we'll say, right? Because there's no need to because you're not actually using those muscles. So let's say you train legs in the morning and then you go for a walk later that day, you're probably going to have better recovery the day after that, because you've got increased oxygenation, you've got increased like blood flow, you've got increased nutrient delivery to those muscles, right? So fantastic. We bring in some light, low-level cardio. That's the first step. Would you agree with that in terms of that being your first intervention? You have someone, they've never done any cardiovascular conditioning. It's, I know, a 40-year-old, 50-year-old, they've got their resistance training down. They're like, I'm training 3 to 4 days per week. What's the next step? I want to get cardiovascularly fitter. Where do you start?
Absolutely. I think that that's such a basic thing that sticks with you for life. Then I think that's one of the big benefits there is that if you can start to build a habit of just walking more every day, then that sticks with you independent of your environment, which is really important because it means that, maybe you'll move jobs and you're not able to access a gym for a certain period of time. So you're not getting any training in. If you've built up that habit of getting out for walks regularly and keeping your steps up, it'll stick with you. So that's something that's really positive from a health perspective. Now, the one exception to that would be if someone is already using up a lot of their um, kind of free time in the gym and they don't really have time or the opportunity to increase their steps, whether it be due to work commitments or whatever it happens to be. Then for that individual, I would consider just going straight to cardio and kind of skipping increasing steps. Like maybe they're at 5, 6,000 and it's just not practical for them to get further than that at the moment. Then maybe adding in, 10, 15 minutes of like, harder cardio at the end of a session might be applicable. But for most people, you should think of it in terms of that kind of pyramid where your base is just being active throughout the day. Again, less of a priority if you're someone at the very high threshold of training already. Like, for example, if you're doing 4 jiu-jitsu sessions per week and you're doing 4 resistance training sessions per week, you're already doing 8 weight training sessions and you're doing 5, 6,000 steps, like getting higher than that, like there's a lower return on investment than if someone was sedentary.
100%. So again, baseline activity, that's the starting point.
Yeah.
Cool, we've got that, right? The next thing in my mind, what I generally like people to do is have some sort of baseline level of aerobic conditioning. Like, I don't think we should be bringing in this really high intensity conditioning if your heart rate is, you struggle to use the aerobic system effectively, right? Now, there's two trains of thought on this, especially because the higher intensity stuff is a little bit more time efficient. So I'm not like hard and fast with this. I'm not going to be like, this is the way we have to do it. However, if we have someone that has the time, I'm probably going to start with aerobic conditioning, right? Now, the unfortunate thing about aerobic conditioning is it kind of takes a little bit of time. It kind of takes a little bit of a longer period of time of actively doing it to actually build the adaptations that we want. You kind of have to be doing cardiovascular, like aerobic conditioning for 30 plus minutes to kind of get we'll call it the left ventricle, the heart adaptations that we want, right? Now, obviously, if you're very unconditioned, you've never done any kind of cardiovascular conditioning, you're probably getting those benefits from like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, cool, right? But if we have someone that's, they've started to actually really adapt to this stuff, they're in a good position, they're kind of, they want to get fitter, and they're not, hugely out of shape, we probably want to bring in some actual like direct cardiovascular, longer, low intensity cardiovascular conditioning. And in my mind, what I just do is like, okay, let's say we have 3 to 4 resistance training sessions. You can do this 2 ways. You can add in like 15 minutes of low intensity cardio at the end of those sessions. That's not my preferred way. My preferred way is to just do a longer activity at the weekend, right? Now, this can be formal cardio in terms of we're going to sit on a treadmill, sit on a bike, stand on a treadmill, go on a stepper, whatever. We're going to do that for 30 to 90 minutes, right? And we're going to keep our heart rate somewhere in the range of 120 to 140 beats per minute, right? That's roughly a kind of pace where you could hold a conversation, but not have an in-depth conversation. Like you can just about talk at that level. You're able to hold a conversation, but someone would know you're exercising, right? That would be my preferred way. Now, again, that doesn't have to be formal in terms of going to the gym. This could be, I'm actually going to go for a 90-minute walk, or maybe a slight jog, or I'm going to go for a hike, or I'm going to do something that's active. I'm going to go for a swim. I'm going to do something that gets my heart rate up, and it's somewhere around that 120, 140 beats per minute. Now, obviously, that's dependent on your environment, whatever. Like, I'm not going to go for a 90-minute hike and I'm in London. Like, where the fuck am I going to go for a hike, So it has to be obviously put into perspective of your own life, your own situation, etc. But 30 to 90 minutes of getting your heart rate elevated is probably going to be my next intervention there. Now, obviously, we have to factor in time commitments. Like if you're doing 4 resistance training sessions already, and then I say, oh yeah, we have to layer on a 90-minute session as well, and you're kind of like, I don't actually have the fucking time for that. It is what it is. So then we're going to have to look at something else. But would that be your next intervention, Gary? Getting someone to do some more aerobic conditioning? Would that be where you'd go next?
Yeah, I think it's a really easy thing to introduce for people too, because I think this is a point I find to be very educational for a lot of clients, where they've done cardio in the past, but anytime they've done it, they've basically just tried to go as hard as they can for that period of time. And the most common one is you see people on the step or the stair mill, what's he called, Stairmaster, and they are doing 30 minutes or 45 minutes, and they're just gasping for breath throughout, and it's just hell. And you don't want to go and do that again, because you're talking about trying to maintain 160, 170, 180 plus beats per minute for 30 to 60 minutes. And that's just really uncomfortable, not nice. And that definitely is going to dig into your weight training recovery, like way more than just the aerobic stuff. Whereas when I tell clients that to slow it down, keep to like 130 to 150, maybe beats per minute, somewhere around there. And they're able to, just breathe comfortably. They can, use their phone and change the song they're listening to or whatever without having to just gasp all the time. That's a lot more comfortable. And it's something that's very easy to implement then, because you're able to recover from it quickly. There's not the same anxiety going into the session. You don't have to hype yourself up for a session like that. You can very easily do it after a weight training session. And it's also the type of thing that you can comfortably listen to a podcast or audiobook while doing. If you're trying to push yourself, like that person on the Stairmaster at holding 170 beats per minute, you might need some more motivational music, and you're trying to, hype yourself up and everything. And all of that actually contributes to the fatigue that you get from a training session, the anxiety before, the fatigue during, and the recovery demands after. So the more casual you can make this, just casually listening to a podcast, sticking with it for 30 to 45 minutes, maybe 60 minutes at 140 beats per minute, it's quite a positive exercise experience. You generally feel better after it than if you were doing a really hard session, because after a really hard session, you feel beat up. Whereas this, it's somewhat restorative, still challenging, but should feel somewhat restorative.
Yeah, 100%. And that is why I like it.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, again, time constraints. The next thing then, if I'm like, look, you've got this, you've adapted to this, you've got aerobic base now, we're in a good position, right? The next thing I would bring in is some more higher intensity stuff, right? Because we can get some nice adaptations from that. And especially if you're already doing resistance training, this gives us an opportunity to add on, 5 to 10 minutes of higher intensity anaerobic stuff at the end of your sessions, right? Now, the thing is, we do have to still be aware of fatigue. We do still have to be aware of the fact that this is going to probably impact your recovery, especially initially until you adapt to it. But if we bring in 5 to 10 minutes of anaerobic conditioning, so we'll call them like sprint intervals at the end of your resistance training sessions, you can be in a great position in terms of you've pretty much knocked out all of your cardiovascular conditioning, all the adaptations you can get. Now, are you going to be the best marathon runner? Are you going to be the best sprinter, etc.? No, because we're adding cardio in. It's not the main focal point of the program, right? So the way I usually do it is, there's a few different, we'll call them protocols you can use, but basically we want to do something that has us doing a work period for, depending on what exact adaptations we're trying to get, somewhere in the range of 10 to 120 seconds of work. And then we probably want to have, like, I personally, if I'm doing anaerobic stuff at the end of a resistance training session, I generally like a kind of 3 to 6 to 1 ratio of rest to work, right? So if I'm doing a 10-second interval, I'll probably have at least a 50-second rest period. And I generally like a little bit of active rest, so we're not just like, boom, static, stop. If I'm doing something like 30 seconds, then I like at least 90 seconds of rest for that. Now, again, it depends on the conditioning of the individual. And if we're doing something like, 2 minutes of hard work, we're probably looking at least call it 3 to 6 minutes of rest. So that doesn't really lend itself to doing that at the end of your resistance training sessions, because you basically 2 minutes of hard work, 3 minutes of recovery. You can do that once, twice, it's not a really beneficial strategy, right? So I generally prefer the kind of shorter intervals, somewhere in the range of 10 to 50 seconds for the kind of sprints. And generally it's usually below 30. And I'm trying to get people to beat their record in terms of how hard they are pushing with those intervals, especially if you have something that can track it, such as like watts or calories per hour or whatever it is, right? And that's generally what I like. And I get that, whatever the intervals are, make that add up to about 5 minutes. We're done. That could be 3 intervals in total, 5 intervals, whatever it is, depending on the exact protocol, and kind of call it good then, right? So you've added in some anaerobic conditioning. Now, obviously, if you're only doing 10 seconds, it's a bit more of that kind of alactic system that we talked about. But even still, it's more of that kind of getting the lacking of oxygen energy system working, right? And that can be fantastic for really improving your conditioning. Now, there is another way that you can do this, which is very fatiguing, but it can be quite effective. And that is to use really, really incomplete rest periods, right? So something like a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 rest to work ratio. So you might do, again, a 30-second interval, and you might only do a 30-second recovery, right? Or a 30-second interval and a 60-second recovery. And you do that knowing that, your performance is going to decrease as the reps go on. And you're doing that so that you can, first of all, burn a little bit more calories, you would hope, but also so that you can kind of really, really push the strain, that kind of the higher heart rate zone. And the thing about this is, it actually becomes more aerobic. The longer you leave that, like, you can't just, again, sprint for 5 minutes. So if you're doing a 5-minute, quote unquote, anaerobic, session where you're doing a 1-to-1 work to rest period, like, by about 2 minutes, that's just becoming more and more aerobic. It just is what it is, right? Because you're not actually able to get the heart rate back down. You're not able, it's not like, your work period, you're getting up to like 180 beats per minute. And then your rest period, you're coming straight back down to 120. Like, that's not happening for most people, even the most conditioned of the conditioned people out there. Like, you're probably not getting that kind of recovery in a 30-second window, right? So it's going to become more aerobic, even though your heart rate is more elevated. And what will happen then is, you'll kind of just start noticing your performance decrease, that top end performance. Like, again, if we're using something like watts for output, and we're like, okay, cool, I want you to get, 2,000 watts on this machine. And you notice, okay, the first sprint I did 2,000, the next one I did 1,800, and the next one I did, 1,400. That's probably the way it's going to go, because, you've basically used up all of the glycogen that's freely accessible at that point, and then you're moving more into this kind of aerobic metabolism. So would that be the way you would go about it, Gary? Add in some sort of anaerobic conditioning at the end of your workout?
Yeah, I'm a fan. I'm a big fan, and like you said, like the ideal is to be able to maintain a slightly longer rest to work ratio than most people do. Like a lot of people when they implement this, they'll do like 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off kind of thing, or even the other way around, they'll go like 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off or whatever. And that's fine in some cases. But I think for the most part, if you're trying to really get the most out of those work intervals, you want to be, at least going with a 2 or 3 times rest to work ratio. Obviously, that varies then depending on the duration of the work period and what you're doing, of course. But I think for the most part, it should be easy enough to get a decent stimulus within maybe 15 minutes or so after your workout. If you use that type of work to rest period, for example, you're doing, 30 seconds, let's say, and then you rest for 60 to 90 seconds, and then you repeat that, whatever, 5 rounds or whatever. That's, a decent amount of training to get in after your session. Longer sessions, if they're approaching 30 minutes and beyond and you're really pushing yourself hard, I would do them on their own. Generally, I encourage clients to do that. In some cases, I'm happy for them to do them after their sessions, but generally as well, if I'm having someone do really hard intervals that are approaching 30 minutes and beyond, there's generally a specific purpose. So, for example, they might be a GA athlete, field sports athlete of some sort, maybe martial arts. Like, there's generally a purpose. So, I would have that as a specific session. Or maybe it might be that they have light upper body work to do and then they do that interval type session. But anything less than, 30 minutes, if it's 15 to 20, 10 to 20, I think that should be achievable after a session. Just think about the crossover between the muscles that you're using there too. So it's obviously going to be superior for most types of intervals to do it after an upper body session than to do it after a really hard lower body session where you've already emptied the tank. Most people won't have much left in the tank after a really hard leg session. So that's something to keep in mind. And also then just in terms of the modalities that you're using, it's important for hard intervals, I generally try to choose low impact options with primarily concentric effort.